for joining us in that moment of silence. So I will start. Truth, truth has always been, it's very interesting that I'm talking about truth. I think for me personally, it's one of the testimonies that is the hardest. Growing up, I was raised in a extremely religious village, in a non-religious family. And so for me, all around me, I saw different people claiming very different truths, but all extremely convinced that their truth was the singular truth. And I wasn't sure where I fit into those aspects of truth. So I thought I fell in between all of them. And so that was very strange. And then I found friends or Quakers, and I saw this commitment to there being that what is sacred in every single person, and that every single person knows what that sacredness is in them, or knows what the journey is for themselves to find that sacredness. And to me, this kind of conjured an image of a constellation of truths in which I felt that I could also belong. And so that's where truth, in a kind of roundabout way, was part of making me feel at home with the Religious Society of Friends in a more theologically abstract way where truth becomes both singular and plural at the same time. That's, of course, quite the theological and abstract bit of my personal experience with truth and faith. But what I'm particularly also thinking about when I think about truth, and I think about this multiplicity, is about the work that I also do here with the Quaker United Nations office. So the Quaker United Nations office, through the Friends World Committee on Consultation, FWCC, we are an organization that has observer status at the IPCC, and IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So for QNO, actually I work on climate change, particularly on the human impacts of climate change. And the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is the international organization in the world that looks at science from all across the world, and based on that science is trying to see, well, where are we with climate change? What is happening? And how do we then kind of move with that? And it's really strange to be in those rooms where they talk about the science as a faith-based organization, because we're the only one there. There's not a single other faith-based organization that shows up in those rooms. And I think that's really interesting, because I think what is really peculiar is that there's often an idea, one, that faith and science don't go together. But here there's a faith voice that is saying we need to listen to the scientists about what is happening to our planet, what's happening to our people. And so there's, of course, a science as truth. However, what is important to explain about the IPCC and how this works is that it's not that the scientists come to these rooms where when they present their reports and they say, oh, we found this. We found Earth has warmed with X amount of degrees. The sea level is rising with X amount of millimeters or centimeters. X amount of permafrost has thawed and melted. No, they present their science, they present a summary of their science, and then all of the states with their government representatives argue about what the summary actually includes. And sometimes they will agree to it and sometimes they don't. And so, of course, then consensus becomes truth, which is something as Quakers we're, of course, very familiar with of meeting for business. But what does it mean when science is up for debate? And this is why I think it's so important that as friends, we are represented in these rooms to be a voice. And when we are discussing what is happening to our planet, there's a voice that speaks for people, that speaks for integrity, and also that speaks for truth. And again, truth is such a fuzzy concept here. For example, we know science is in a lot of ways, quote unquote, truth, but we also know that IPCC is significantly more conservative in its climate science compared to some individual academics or institutions around the world, because otherwise they would be afraid that states might not agree to publishing that science. So there, truth already becomes negotiated. But does it make it less truthful, or does it make it truthful to that specific context and reality? So for me, when I think of the testimony of truth, it asks me to think what I see as my truth. And for me, that is seeing that the beloved community is possible, and that our duty is to aid in its realization and to speak out against what endangers that. So for me, truth, how you define it, whether you believe there's only one or several truths out there, it becomes a form of justice. Truth becomes a form of justice. Truth becomes a form of shining a light on things that are unseen. When we talk about the climate science, how do we show that we're not just talking about statistics, graphs, and numbers, but that this affects real people? That science is political, that truth is a moral obligation and a moral call for action. And with that, I hand the floor to Anya.
Thank you, Detmer. Thank you. So before I begin, I just wanted to mention that I'm speaking from a British Quaker's perspective. And often when I'm going to say Quaker, I might be meaning British Quakers rather than global Quakers, although a lot of it may be relatable to other Quakers around the world, but I don't want to presume what's going on in other sections. And all I know is about what's happening mainly in Britain. So an obvious statement, we're grounded in truth. I think that's one of the core testimonies. And I think, as Detmer said, it's often one of the most difficult testimonies. And I know that I've definitely struggled with that testimony. And when I was thinking about what I could speak about, I was thinking about different truths that I saw relating to peace and climate justice, and have chosen 3 truths as I see it to kind of speak about today. So these are the truths as I see it. So the first one, we're in a climate crisis, and the West is largely responsible for that crisis. I think it's really important that we take responsibility for this. I acknowledge that I, as part of the Western world, am largely responsible for this climate breakdown. And the truth is there, and we need to acknowledge it and take responsibility and make the changes necessary to reduce this impact. But unfortunately, there are many that are still in denial about whether the climate crisis is there or whether they're responsible for it. And this includes Quakers. I have met Quaker climate deniers. And the second truth is that there's people around the world who've been telling us about the climate crisis for decades, and we've ignored them. Historically, climate activism has been perceived as a white middle-class movement, but this is far from the truth. Too often, my voice and that of other white middle-class people have overshadowed the voices of those who know the truth of the climate crisis, those who are experiencing the worst of the breakdown and who are already being massively affected. And to put it bluntly, the truth is Greta Thunberg did not start the youth climate movement, and nor did Extinction Rebellion. And they didn't even necessarily play a massive role in it. The climate movement has existed for decades, and those that are less privileged at the front of the climate crisis, facing it now, are the voices we need to hear, the ones who know the truth much more than I do. We need to listen to and acknowledge the truths within our movement. Earlier this year, many of you may have seen it on the news, Vanessa Nakate, a Ugandan young climate activist, posed for a photo next to Greta Thunberg at the World Economic Forum in Davos. But the photo the world saw, we wouldn't have known that Vanessa was there. Before it had been published, she was cropped out so that only Greta and 3 other white climate activists were visible. And the stories that we see are not the full truth. For me, this was yet another reminder of the privilege I have as a partially white middle-class climate activist in the Western world, and the voices of those that we do not get to hear. How much of the truth are we missing? The UK youth strikes movement is predominantly white and middle class. And the voices who should be listened to and believed are once again being pushed to the back and covered up. We need to be critical friends within our movements to reverse this trend. And the third truth is we need to be open to accepting not only our successes, but also our failures. For the last year and a half, I've been involved with multiple different climate groups, including the youth strike movement, taking to the streets to bring demands directly to our leaders, whilst others have been meeting and lobbying their MPs, or putting their bodies on the road, preventing the transport of weapons or access to fracking sites. Some of these have had successes, such as the fact that we now have a fracking moratorium, but others have had very little impact. The climate strikes in the UK have been successful in the sense that they've increased public attention on the crisis and brought many young people into the movement who otherwise might not have gotten involved. However, I believe we need to think about where we're going from here and be clearer about our goals in order to make effective change. As British Quakers, I and we need to acknowledge the privileges we have. This can be uncomfortable, and it's definitely something that I'm struggling with myself. What I do know is that for me, the process is key, because this will determine the final outcome. Quakers in Britain still need to do much more work on understanding and addressing our privilege. And our challenges around the world, as different parts of the Quaker family, might be different, but our values and faith are something that we share. And this is where I feel, as young people, if we work together across borders, we could educate each other and provide support to enable us to work both within and outside of our Quaker community to build our vision for a just world.